Hi everyone, it's Matt Defanis. A few weeks ago, I posted and shared with you all a behind-the-scenes tour of my office studio, where you were able to see the lighting setup, the audio setup, and my mother of all webcams setup. So I'm using a full-frame mirrorless camera connected to my computer as a really massive overkill webcam. And it's because of that big sensor, that full-frame sensor, and some pretty nice glass that I get this distinct blurred background. Now today I'm coming to you from my home studio space, which is an almost identical setup. I'm shooting this today from my home studio because this is a setup where I can more easily get to the camera and change lenses and show you some specific samples related to lens options. So I've gotten lots of positive feedback on that behind-the-scenes office tour, but a lot of the follow-up questions have been thematically clustered around subjects relating to the lenses, focal length, aperture, and other lens-related questions. So this session is not intended only for nerds. Well, I mean, you have to be somewhat nerdy to even care, but it doesn't require that you be a total deep-in-the-weeds photo nerd. This video is aimed at a couple of different categories of people. Either you may be somebody who already has a mirrorless camera, and with a few tweaks and maybe with very little having to be purchased, you could recreate this effect using gear that's mostly already sitting around that you already own. The second category would be somebody who is looking to buy a set of gear from scratch and wants to pick the right stuff to replicate this. And I'll tell you, one of the best advantages of using an external mirrorless camera as your mother of all webcams is the fact that the current generation of mirrorless cameras are so much more versatile than anything that we had up until just the last couple of years. So in the past, as a longtime serious photographer, I would have to use a purpose-built video camera if I wanted to get good video quality. And I would have to use a purpose-built DSLR if I wanted to get really good quality or fast-performing photographic quality, particularly if I was doing something specialized like fast action sports. And now the current crop of mirrorless cameras, including some of the relatively inexpensive ones that you can get with a bundled kit lens for well under $1,000, these now offer the ability to do all of the things I just described. Be great dedicated still cameras, be really good video cameras, and then on top of all of that, be tethered to your computer to create this mother of all webcams. And when I say that mother of all webcams, what I mean is people look at my Zoom window and they immediately notice the image quality is better, the colors are a little more vibrant, but most notably, the background is really this buttery, smooth, blurred effect. And it's not a special effect. It's not me on a green screen. That's an optical effect that is the result of a large image sensor and a nice piece of glass. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to give you a couple of bits of vocabulary and a few reference points in the room with me as I then walk you through a comparison of different types of lenses, focal lengths, aperture settings, so you have an idea of what it would look like if you go for a higher dollar setup with a dedicated prime lens, i.e. not a zoom lens, or if you were just going to get something right off the shelf and use a kit lens bundled with it. So first, let's talk what aperture is. Aperture is, think of it as the iris on the lens. It's the thing closest to the camera body when your lens is on the camera that lets the light in to hit the image sensor. And apertures can always be varied. They get larger and they get smaller. More expensive lenses have a larger maximum aperture, and the smaller number means the larger aperture. Well, prime lenses, not zoom lenses, tend to be where you'll find that largest, widest aperture. It's those larger, it's also referred to as fast glass, a fast lens. Fast because it lets in more light so you can do other things with it. So it's those wide aperture lenses that will tend to have the more pronounced blur effect. So my native habitat now is shooting with a 35 millimeter focal length at f1.8. So it's not a zoom lens. You can't get zoom lenses that go that wide. It's a fixed focal length lens that I use. And this isn't a studio setup in terms of a camera that's 10 or 12 feet away. It's not a news anchor setup. Again, a scenario where you have a large camera that's much farther away. My camera is just less than a foot beyond the tip of my fingers. So my setup is designed for me to be able to stand at a stand-up workstation with large desktop monitors, an array of them, not have those in the way, be able to make good eye contact, not have myself look ridiculously distorted because of something extremely wide, for example, and you'll see examples of that coming up. So those are the things I'm looking for, is how I can have this set at more or less webcam distance and look and sound my best. So for your reference, my native habitat is 35 millimeters at f1.8 for a camera that is clamped to the far end of my desk and is, roughly 4 feet away from my face. Now, one of the things you'll notice as we go into the comparison shots, as we change focal lengths and as we change aperture, it will have an impact on how much background separation there is. That is, how crisply am I pulled away from the background with the background kind of blurred into the background. And so I've put this little decorative tree over my shoulder. That's about 4 feet away, and that's a useful point of reference. You'll see there's a wall hanging back there. That's more like 10, 12 feet away, and then there's a really large TV that's off at an angle. From me, that's more like 15 to 20 feet away. So as you watch the different focal lengths and as you watch the different aperture settings, pay particular attention to the blur effect and differing amounts of how much separation there's going to be from the background. The upshot is that this setup that I'm using has a really high amount of background separation. It really blurs out what is behind me. A kit lens is not going to do it anywhere near this dramatically, but it doesn't mean that you couldn't still massively step up your game by using a larger sensor camera with a kit lens. And I'll show you examples of how that will look in the comparison shots coming up. So pay attention to my background, pay attention to my decorative tree and see how that changes with different settings. And then I'll be back after you see the different lens settings to give you some closing thoughts. Thanks so much for coming along on my photographic and video nerd adventure with me today. So this is a demo of a 20 millimeter full frame view at f1.8. So that's a large aperture. The large aperture, that f1.8, would tend to blur the background, but the wider the angle, the more of the background and the less blur you will see. This is actually the same lens, but I have set the camera to the crop format. So the camera is now using a center portion of the image. So this is the equivalent of a 30 millimeter lens. Now when you're cropping in on the lens, it would be the equivalent of, maybe an f2.8 or so on a full frame sensor. So this is what 30 millimeters looks like. You can see that the background has narrowed. I'm filling up more of the frame. And for a point of reference, the camera lens is about 4 feet away at this. So obviously you can compensate for these differences in view by moving your camera closer or farther away, but this is the equivalent of a 30 millimeter view. So you are now looking at me on a 35 millimeter lens at f1.8. Now this has me framed up the way I want to be framed up. This is the setting that I would normally use. This is the lens that I would normally use. You'll notice a few different things. Number one, the slice of background that is visible has gotten narrower yet again. So depending on your setting, that means there's less background to be worried about. You'll also notice that the background has blurred a little bit more, that I'm separating from the background a little better than I was at that ultra wide 20 millimeter or slightly wider 30 millimeter equivalent. So what you're seeing right now would be 35 millimeter full frame at f1.8. Now, if you're using an external camera, a mirrorless or a DSLR with a kit lens, this is going to be in the focal range that a kit lens is going to include. But a kit lens isn't going to be this light sensitive. It won't have this wide f1.8 aperture. So next I'll show you same focal length, but with the apertures stopped down to show you a range that would be more typical of what a kit camera would give you. So that's coming up next. So this is 35 millimeter at f2.8. This would still be probably a little bit wider than a typical kit lens would go, but I'm showing you this incrementally so you can see what the background looks like. It should be slightly less out of focus than it was at f1.8, and then the next stop will be f4. f4 is where a typical kit lens would get you, so that's up next. So this is 35 millimeters at f4. If you were to get a typical kit lens that came bundled with a mirrorless or a DSLR, that's usually going to include this focal length, meaning this width, this 35 millimeter equivalent focal length, and those cheaper lenses are not as light sensitive, and so this would be what those would look like. Again, less background separation, but still, compared to any sort of a traditional webcam, you'll notice image quality is still very good, and I still am separated from the background much more than I would be if I were using a smaller sensor traditional webcam, and certainly way more so than if I were using an onboard integrated webcam in a notebook computer or a tablet, for example. So this is 35 millimeters f4. Okay, so this is me all up in your grill. This is a 50 millimeter lens, 50 millimeters. I'm going to take a couple steps back as far as my microphone arm will reach. 50 millimeters is what's considered a normal focal length. That is to say, it is neither telephoto, it's not designed to magnify images, and it's not wide angle. It's not designed to shrink images to fit in a wider field of view. This is also at f1.8. 50 millimeter f1.8 lenses are typically among the least expensive, usually the least expensive prime lens that you can buy. Also, if you're getting any sort of a camera with a kit lens, 50 millimeters or the equivalent of 50 millimeters is going to be within the range of the kit lens. Now, if you're using your camera at a webcam sort of a distance, you can tell this is a little tight. And I've already stepped back from my desk, so I really can't reach my keyboard comfortably from here. So 35 is where my setup is designed for. 50 is a little tight. Okay, so if you're still with me, you've lived through all of those comparison shots, and you've hopefully noticed that when I said that 35 millimeters f1.8 is my native habitat, you're starting to see why that makes sense. You've seen that 50 millimeters is way too close, way too tight, unless I move my camera farther back. And if I move my camera farther back, I have other problems. I have monitors that are right here. If I move my lens farther back, then I'm going to have more challenges in terms of working around these monitors. The other thing is, in my office, I have a teleprompter set up, and I'm not usually using it to actually read scripts. Usually, I have a small monitor that bounces into it so I can make eye contact with people in my Zoom window. And if I put my camera farther back, that monitor gets smaller and I can't see as well, and I have to get a bigger, more expensive, heavier teleprompter setup. So you're seeing that the longer focal length either gets too tight or it requires that you push the camera farther back. Both here and at my office, my workstations are near a wall, so I can't really push the camera farther back. In both cases, it's on a clamp desk mount at the other end of my desk. At the really wide end, you saw that you get this somewhat distorted view that's not terribly flattering on your face. It makes you look kind of small even from only a few feet away, and you're getting huge amounts of background. And unless you're meticulous about keeping things clean and tidy, the background separation isn't great, and you've got a huge field of view that has to be looking intentional and clean. So once again, that now gives you some perspective on why, for webcam type use, 35 millimeters f1.8 is my native habitat. If you have any questions, of course, you all know where to find me, but I hope you'll find this useful. I guess one final thought I'll point out, some of the less expensive cameras are crop sensors. What that means is, I talked about my camera being a full frame sensor. The image sensor is exactly the same size as a 35 millimeter film frame. If you're much younger than me, that's film, which cameras used to use in the olden days, back when I started doing photography. So the cheaper cameras use smaller image sensors. They're frequently referred to as crop sensor, or Nikon calls them DX format sensors, and there's a line of lenses for DX sensors. All you need to know about those, you can still get a very similar effect, but what you need to know about crop sensors is, if I say 35 millimeter, I'm talking about 35 millimeter on a full frame sensor. If you're using a crop sensor, that's going to be more the equivalent of a 24 millimeter lens on a crop sensor. So just be careful when you're shopping for products. Make sure you're looking at the effective focal length. So if it's a crop sensor camera and a crop sensor lens, that may be a 24 millimeter lens that behaves like a 36 millimeter lens in a 35 millimeter full frame equivalent. So if that's got you confused, let me know. But all of the focal lengths, 20, 30, 35, 50, that I've demonstrated in this video, those are all full frame equivalents. So I hope you found this useful if you're on the same journey that I've been on this year, which is trying to look and sound your best if this is going to be our native habitat for the foreseeable future. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. I appreciate it.